to today's episode of Pro Democracy Podcast with Mila Ghorayeb and I. Today we're going to be talking about, we called our episode Cracking Open Chinagate. So Mila asked me, what is Chinagate? And my response was, it's all of it, right? It's like every bit of scandal, controversy, propaganda that we're being fed on a monthly basis. It seems like every month there's a new thing. And today we're actually fortunate to have Carl Zha with us to talk about recent developments in Taiwan with the U.S. It being revealed that the U.S. for the last year has been secretly training the Taiwanese military. And we have Josh Cho. He's an excellent journalist who has been pretty thoroughly covering the lab leak theory from a perspective which has, through his reporting, he's shown that most of the talking points that promote this idea that the coronavirus leaked through the Wuhan Institute of Virology are actually just false and being misrepresented by the media. This is something that I actually covered, and I believe I was censored for trying to cover. So a quick aside before we get to our guests. Actually, on the day that Josh put out his first article about the lab leak was the same day that I put out my article, but my article wasn't really an investigative report like Josh's was. He was much more thorough than me. And the reason for that was because my article was initially intended to be an opinion article with Business Insider. So I got a contract with Business Insider to write one op-ed per month for them. So I pitched my first op-ed. It was about the lab leak. They accepted it, and I wrote it, and then it made it through the first round of edits before it made it to a second editor. And at that point, the second editor, while he was editing it in the Google Doc, I could see this. I was informed that I would not be able to publish that with them. And they gave me a really obtuse response. I've written about this on my Substack, so I don't want to go too long. You guys can see the rationale they gave me. But then a week later, they completely canceled my contract, so I never actually published anything with them. So it's a very contentious topic. I would say that it goes against the grain of what is acceptable to report in mainstream outlets. I think a big part of that is not just that it, covering this is in an effort to tone down hostility with China, but really the CIA's role through their stenographers in the press, through their obedient lackeys in the media, in the Washington Post and other outlets, was able to mainstream this idea, because it was once at first, the first year of the coronavirus, it was very, the consensus was that the lab leak theory was bunk. You couldn't talk about it on Facebook. Facebook did, in fact, censor it. And then there was overnight kind of a change in tune. So I kind of showed how the CIA played a hand in all of that. But what Josh has done has been far more thorough in debunking this theory. So I'm really excited to have both Carl and Josh on with us today. It looks like, Josh, your connection is kind of poor. Are you able to communicate? No, I don't think so.
Can you hear me now?
Josh? Yeah. So thanks for joining us, guys.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. My internet's a little spotty. I can hear you, but I'm not sure if you can hear me.
We can hear you. You're pretty blurry, and your frames aren't really moving. Well, is there something that you can do to figure out your Wi-Fi situation, and we can talk to Carl a little bit first? Do you have an Ethernet cable, maybe?
Okay, yeah, I'll try and figure out what's going on. I'll be right back.
Okay, so we'll talk to Carl.
I'm a little bit too far from my router for Ethernet cable to work.
Okay. So hopefully Josh will be joining us again in a minute. Thank you for bearing with us. Carl is the host of the Silk and Steel podcast. He's very vocal on Twitter in debunking anti-China propaganda. He's one of my favorite people to follow. He's just hilarious. And what I love about Carl's tweets is just how he gathers the most absurd shit that China hawks are saying and just puts it out there, just for people to be like, realize how crazy they are, how hungry for hostility they are. So I can't think of a more perfect time to have you on the podcast than, this week when hostilities are so high. I think one mistake that I've been seeing a lot repeated in the media on Twitter is that the U.S. and China are closer to war. And I think that's a mistake because I don't see an actual hot war happening, regardless of how heightened the tensions are right now. The U.S. would lose so quickly, right? We're dealing with a population that's many times bigger than our own. And I think a military that has a little bit more discipline, just if you know any people in the U.S. military or read the news, you can get a pretty good idea of how frequently there are problems with troop discipline, and I think that would play a big role. But
did you see that news? The U.S. nuclear submarine just ran into something unknown in South China Sea. This just happened a couple of days ago.
Yeah, China doesn't really do that, and you know what? If they did, I don't think the media would find out. They have a better control on that kind of stuff. But so yeah, that's exactly my point, Carl. So I mean, what's your take on all this? I think it's fair to say that there's already war. It's just a hybrid war. It's information, economic, cultural, other things. But what's your take on all that, Carl?
Unfortunately, right now in U.S., the competition with China is bipartisan. On one side we have the ultra hawks. They want a confrontation with China over Taiwan. And on the other side, the doves, quote unquote doves, they say, well, let's cool it off a little bit. Let's try with economic sanctions. This is the two sides of the debate in U.S. right now. There's nobody saying, hold up, wait a minute. Why do we have to have this tension with China? Why is this necessary? Nobody bothered to explain. And regarding the current crisis over Taiwan, I think we have to keep in mind, even United States government bureaucracy is not one monolith. And there are different interest groups, particularly the national security establishment has been edging for a confrontation with China for a long, long time. I mean, ever since the collapse of Soviet Union in 1990, U.S. military and the Pentagon and all the intelligence military complex, they wanted to portray China as some kind of Soviet Union 2.0, just to justify the defense budget. They didn't want cut back after the end of Cold War. And so I remember I came to United States in 1990, and right away I was already reading about articles in mainstream media about so-called China threat. But back in 1990, China was still a developing country. It's still trying to pull itself through poverty. So it's not very convincing. The argument that China was Soviet Union 2.0 was not convincing. And for a long time, there was two camps in U.S. There's the pro-engagement camp and the containment camp. Pentagon has always been on the containment camp, but they were balanced by the pro-engagement camp in the business community because they just want to go to China and make tons of money. They want to leverage the Chinese cheap labor, the newly open Chinese market. So for a long time, there was a balance. But until very recently, I say happened in the last 5 years, what what China has done is China has pulled itself up and economically, and now China is also an economic threat to the U.S. hegemony in the world. That's why the previous pro-engagement camp in U.S. the business community, now they have backed off because they realize now the China is a rival to them. People like especially a lot of the big tech companies in U.S. That have dominated our lives. Facebook, Google, all of them, they already achieved hegemony in much of the world. For example, when the Facebook went out, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, it went out not just for United States, it went out for much of the world. I'm in Indonesia. I was affected. I couldn't get on Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. But China is still holding out because China, they had the great firewalls, they had their own apps, they built TikTok. For the Chinese, for the American tech giant, that is a threat. That is why you're seeing the U.S. There was during the Trump administration, there was even an attempt to kill off TikTok, and because
capture.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to get TikTok sold off to Microsoft, and so right now it's a full spectrum, like you said, a hybrid war with China. But there's degrees of differences. So if you notice recently, Biden actually reiterated the U.S. commitment to the one China principle and recognized that Taiwan is part of China. Right away, you see all these news items about Chinese warplanes invading "quote unquote" Taiwan airspace, and then U.S. aircraft carriers sailing into South China Sea. So many people there's many people in the national security establishment. They do not want to see U.S. move into a more conciliatory stance with China. They didn't like what Biden sound bites lately, so they're doing their best trying to keep pushing the confrontation forward. Example,
that's interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but real quick, it's almost like what we saw with Trump, where he would put out this policy idea that was kind of more in favor of detente with the DPRK, for example, and then he was totally undermined by the media, the military, and all the other kind of establishment forces. So
and
that's really interesting.
Russiagate, because he reset with Russia was a big Trump Trump idea, but the blob totally pushed against it because the NATO, all the jobs at stake in the NATO institution, this is good American jobs at stake here. So so we're seeing similar thing playing out against China right now. It's because there's also a party divide in United States. The Democrats who were pushing for the Russiagate, right, during the Trump years, whereas the Democrats want to get tough with China, and right now, there's not even much pushback from a Republican on getting tough with China. Everybody in U.S. want to get tough on China. Yeah, so that's where we are. And if you actually look at for example, the latest so-called Taiwan crisis, it's a lot of manufactured nothing burger. A lot of the media reporting the Chinese are running 100 incursions into the Taiwan "quote unquote" airspace. So it gives you the impression that Chinese fighter jet is flying over the city of Taipei. People are looking up and seeing Chinese fighter jet in the sky. That's not even the case. The Chinese fighter jet didn't even cross the island of Taiwan anywhere close. What was the reported incursion was actually reported by the Taiwan Defense Ministry. They reported an incursion against the Taiwan ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. So for people who are interested, I encourage you to Google ADIZ. There's actually a Wikipedia article on ADIZ, and there's an entry under Taiwan. You can see the map of the Taiwan ADIZ zone. Fully half of it is actually over Chinese mainland. So you can see how Yeah, over the land of Chinese mainland. But then people are saying, oh, wait a minute. But the latest incursion was not over the Chinese mainland. It was over the other half. That's correct. The Taiwan Defense Ministry was actually kind enough to post like hourly updates of all the PLA flight path across their ADIA zone. And you can see from the map they posted, most of these PLA flight over, they're still circling closer to the mainland Chinese coast rather than anywhere near Taiwan. It's just because of Taiwan drew this ridiculously large ADIA zone, which, by the way, was designed by United States Armed Forces in 1950s. So during the Cold War, U.S. design there's no international law. There's no international law basis for ADIA zone. It's something that any country just declare unilaterally. And United States is the first country that declared ADIA zone around United States. And then it instituted ADIA zone in Japan and South Korea during the Cold War, during Korean War. And it also put this ridiculously large ADIA zone over Taiwan. So China is saying we don't recognize that. But there is a more increased frequency of Chinese flight path skirting the edges of these ADIA zones. So the way that the Chinese Air Force did it, they didn't want to be overly provocative, like flying directly over the island of Taiwan. What they're doing instead, they're cutting corners and around the edges of this Taiwan ADIA zone and just saying, hey, we don't recognize your ADIA zones. This is international airspace. But what Chinese action is response of is actually a response of to the U.S. action, which is rarely talked about in the media. Currently, U.S. is holding military exercise with Japan and U.K. They send 4 aircraft carrier strike groups into South China Sea. This happened just before the reported Chinese incursion into Taiwan airspace. This is what Chinese are responding to. They understand that Taiwan is just a client state of the United States. They don't need to do this demonstration to Taiwan. They're doing this to United States. They know you're coming to the South China Sea. Look, we don't care about this ADIA zone created by the United States Air Force, and we also let you know that we have the coverage over South China Sea that you are now entering into. So this is that's every time in the U.S. MSM what they do is do the news by omission. They tell partial truth. They tell you about the Chinese flight over. They don't emphasize on the fact that there's a 4 aircraft carrier strike group sailing into South China Sea to perform military drills. Thousands of miles from the mainland United States coast.
Yeah. So my question to you is: has China laid any high-speed rail in Taiwan's airspace?
We all would like to see that.
Well,
Okay.
go ahead, Mila, please.
I found, like you had mentioned, there was like a bipartisan consensus on China and the US. And what I find very disturbing in Canada is the media is really, and I said this in our Cuba episode too, but the media is really like trying to punish politicians who do not want war with China. We had an MP here who tried to say, maybe we should be diplomatic with them, and with the whole Two Michaels story. And what happened is that the media then kind of started like, accusing her of sympathizing with dictators. There was like whole articles dedicated to that. There's media that's, basically begging our prime minister to be tougher on China. And so I'd also be curious for you and Josh as well to sort of speak to the role that the media has been playing in this, as well as the political parties.
This is a definitely an orchestrated campaign. What you're witnessing in Canada has already played out in Australia. You know, Australian the politicians in Australia who wanted friendly relationship with China has already been effectively silenced over the last few years. There's a whole campaign in Australia stirred up by ASPI, the ostensibly Australian think tank that's had most of its budget supplied by United States State Department and Lockheed Martin. They accuse any Australian politicians who want conciliatory role toward China as Beijing stooge, you know, CCP stooge in Australia, and they pushed a bunch of legislation against so-called CCP influencing Australian politics. So they actually conducted a witch hunt in Australia. Now all the voice that's asking Australia to have a reasonable relationship with China has been effectively silenced. And I don't know how they orchestrated, but if I treat it as a black box and watch it as an observer from outside, it does appear like a media or orchestrated media campaign. I think that ties to what Josh is going to talk about is on the COVID lab leak theory that originally was pushed by White House officials under Trump administration. It was Matt Pottinger, who was a deputy national security advisor. He was tasked with handling the initial U.S. COVID response, but they screwed up so bad that he decided the best thing we can do now is shift the blame to China. So he worked through his media pets, like Josh Rogan in Washington Post, and really pushing hard for the lab leak theory. That, unfortunately, even after Biden came to power, the Democrats had a chance to step back